Welcome to Unsafe Space. I'm Carter Laren. Please go to unsafespace.co to support the show. That's .co, not .com. The M stands for Marxism, and we have none of that here. You can find us on YouTube /Unsafe Space, and I think we're also on BitChute as well as a few other places. I'm joined today by Dr. Colin Wright. Dr. Wright is an evolutionary biologist at Penn State who studies the social behavior of insects, ants, wasps, that kind of thing, and also spiders. So if you're an arachnophobe, he's not your friend. He recently wrote an excellent article in Quillette titled "The New Evolution Deniers," which I highly recommend that you read. You can follow him on Twitter at SwipeRight, WRIGHT. I guess, are you looking for dates? Welcome to the show, Dr. Wright.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Sure. Like I said, thank you for coming. So let's start with I think a lot of people don't really know what evolutionary biology is in the first place. I mean, people kind of vaguely know often what evolution is, but maybe not what the field of evolutionary biology is. Can you just give us an overview?
Yes, I mean, it depends kind of what aspect you're studying. There's people who study it from like a genetics point of view where they're tracking selection on certain genes through time. So you can look at how certain traits are being selected, for instance, and the strength of selection. What I study, though, I don't look at genes or anything like that. I guess more specifically, you'd call what I do is being an evolutionary behavioral ecologist. And so what all that basically means is I'm looking at behavior of organisms, and I'm seeing the fitness consequences of that type of behavior. So I specifically study this in the context of like social groups. So I'm looking at like the personality of individuals within groups, and then how their individual personalities kind of combine to create these emergent colony level personalities, and then how these differences in both individual and group behavior influences things like the colony's survival or how well they perform certain tasks. So these proxies for basically group success. So that's basically what I'm doing, and it's kind of a subfield of evolutionary biology, but I'm not specifically tracking genes or selection, just kind of using proxies for those types of things.
So I honestly, you had a sentence in your article that said something about the personality study of animal behavior is a vibrant field of study or something. I think was the phrase that you used. It wasn't something that occurred to me. I think most people don't think ants have personalities or think of wasps having individual personalities, but you're saying actually on the individual level, even insects have different behavioral traits, different personality types, basically.
Oh yeah, exactly. So I mean, if we commonly think of personalities as being in humans, your friends, they have different personalities. People are more docile or aggressive, or they're introverts or extroverts, things like that. And then if anyone has, if you have two dogs or two cats, you'll notice that they have distinct personalities. Some are going to be more aggressive, some are more docile. There's all types of ways you can classify their behavior, how explorative they are, how much they, if they're going to tend to run away if you open the gate for your yard, or if they're just going to stay inside. And so this is kind of what we normally think about when we think of personality, but it's actually true of just wild animals as well. So just as no two individual, like a dog or cat, behaves the same way, same thing with field mice, ants, spiders, everything. They all behave certainly in mildly different ways. And this is kind of a way that they can kind of carve out their individual niche in the environment as well. So there's been this big idea in the past that sort of behavioral differences among animals, it's just kind of adaptive noise. It's not really important. It's just, just behavioral variation. But over the last several decades, it's been pretty clear that this behavioral variation is actually quite adaptive. And then especially in the context of like a social group, you have within one colony, you'll have all this, extreme behavioral variation, and colonies are actually using this variation to divide their labor. So certain individual personality types are better at, attacking predators, and some are better, caretakers. And so what I'm doing is basically looking at, what are the fitness consequences of this? How does the spider society or an ant society kind of divide labor among personality traits rather than something like morphology or something.
And are these traits, I guess, presumably they're based in genetics, or would the social justice warriors of the ant world say that these are just social constructs?
So it appears that no, there's no blank slate going on in these animals. Now, that's not to say that conditioning or early life experience can't influence these traits. And there are some species where early life experience is definitely more important for predicting their behavior and the personality traits later. But we usually tend to find pretty high heritability of a lot of traits.
Okay. Okay.
My spider is pretty high as well.
So let's jump in, I guess, to the. I just was curious about the science, but let's jump in a little bit. You said that you listed 4 people as being inspirations for your career choice: Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Stephen Fry, and Christopher Hitchens. God rest his soul, God in quotes for Christopher Hitchens. But Richard Dawkins, incidentally, The Selfish Gene changed my view of evolution completely. It's a great book. I don't know if it's accurate. Was it still accurate? Would you still recommend it, or is it not a good layman's book?
I would definitely recommend it for sure. It's still, I mean, the bones of it are still really good. The gene's eye, center of evolution. A lot of main problems with it is people took it too literally and didn't realize that it's the genes aren't actually selfish. It's just kind of a way.
Well, that's just a title.
Genes preserve themselves just because they replicate because they replicate because they replicate. But otherwise, no, it's an amazing book for sure.
Yeah. Okay. I always thought the selfish was pretty obviously a metaphor, but I guess some people didn't see it that way.
You'd be surprised how people just read it by title only, apparently.
Fair. So one thing I wanted to say, those were all outspoken atheists, and I don't know what time frame you were kind of deciding your career or thinking about what path to go down, but I assume that at the time, the big threat to science and evolution theory was really coming from the Christian right and the kind of the radical Christian right more than the left. Is that true?
Yeah, at the time. So I was probably in my early 20s around that time, like 2005, 2006. And it really, I mean, I was doing real estate at the time, and I was a business major in school, and I wasn't enjoying it. But in my spare time, I was reading a lot of, Richard Dawkins and Stephen Gould and things like that. And I just got sort of entranced by evolutionary biology, and then, that kind of led to being involved in the creationism, intelligent design, entire debate thing. And so, that early time with Richard Dawkins was pivotal in me choosing, just my path to become an evolutionary biologist for sure. I don't think I'd be one today if it wasn't for Richard Dawkins, almost certainly.
Okay. So that kind of intelligent design threat, so to speak, has really subsided. I mean, I hadn't realized it until I read your article and I stopped and thought, I haven't really heard a lot about intelligent design anymore. I guess that kind of fell away. But all is not well. It was replaced by a different threat. Do you want to just kind of introduce the threat that you noticed and the main subject of your piece?
Yeah, I also just want to note too that it was funny because as soon as I wrote that article, putting down intelligent design, saying it's sort of withered to irrelevancy, then all of a sudden my Twitter, all the intelligent design people showed up en masse saying we're still here.
I see. Well,
they're just kind of simmering below the surface, it seems.
There is even a flat Earth society still, so
they're out there for sure. But so it's true that in general, in the last 8-10 years, something like that, it just hasn't seemed to be really front and center. They lost the big court case in the 2000s, and then they just kind of went away. And then for a long time, everything seemed all right. And then it wasn't until maybe 3 or 4 years ago I've just started to see kind of this more, I guess you could call it just this politically correct notions of human behavior, and I've been starting to see sort of this creeping evolution denialism coming from the left in a way. So reverting back to blank slate psychology, this idea that we all start off our brains are identical, and the only behavioral differences we see between males and females in humans is just purely a result of our upbringing. And then, that was something that was concerning, but it's always been there to some degree, even it's been ramping up. And then it just became kind of even more jarring when I started seeing people start bringing up things like, that sex itself is a social construct, not just, our behaviors, but like the actual biological sex, just like, male and female, and that is somehow no longer a thing. It's just the social constructionists have really just like, in my piece I said, they're just jumping the shark basically, and just going full moron here. It's quite astonishing. Yeah.
So let's talk about this, because you mentioned that they kind of set up what looks like to me to be this false dichotomy of this tabula rasa psychology viewpoint, right, where all brains are identical and all like everything's identical and everything, all the differences are social, and then they kind of criticize the evolutionary biologists by categorizing them as evolutionary essentialists, where they basically are saying, well, it's not all biology, but or it's not all genetics. But I don't think any scientist is saying it's all genetics. Can you tell us, like, what is it? I used some good analogies in your article. What is the actual science here?
Yeah, I mean, so like most things are pretty complex, and it's going to be a combination of genetics and environment. We call that like a G by E interaction. And I've never met any behavioral scientist who would deny the importance of socialization and how that can change the development of your mind and change your tendencies. But that we also have innate evolved differences. We see them in our closest primate ancestors and in mammals generally. And when we see things like sexual dimorphism in a species where males are, or there's a difference in size between the sexes, we kind of see certain patterns of behavior, and humans are no different. So there's no reason to think that, that we've somehow lost all these traits that we see in our common ancestors, just from pure socialization. Like the idea that we've lost all of these traits without any, remnants of their past, only to have these traits recapitulated in the present due to socialization, matching the exact patterns that we would expect to see if they were innate traits. Like that's just there's no real basis for that. Like the best explanation is we've inherited these behavioral traits from our common ancestors.
Right.
So that's.
And I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but in humans, I think the brain is like 20% of the calorie consumption is the brain. So the idea that there would be no evolutionary pressure on the brain seems a little silly to me. Just as a layperson.
I don't know the exact energetics behind that, but I mean, the easiest thing to evolve is behavioral differences, because small changes in development can change the way animals behave very quickly. It's really hard to sometimes evolve, like a hard shell or something like that, but you can easily evolve a behavioral differences that will make you, go to a shelter or something. So it's a way that you can adapt to your environment by choosing aspects of your environment to dwell in. And so usually what we see behavioral changes first, and then these are sometimes followed by a morphological change if it's a strong enough selection pressure.
Interesting.
So brains are actually, behavior is the easiest, almost the first thing that leads the way in terms of the evolution of many traits that we see. So this idea that, everything is due to socialization and not evolution, that's just completely wrong. We see personality, I said, in, ants, bees, wasps, almost any animal that you study, almost any species that we've ever looked for personality in nature, we've basically found it's becoming the null hypothesis that personality exists in nature, and whenever we don't find it, it's always a shock. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Now let's just be clear to people. Let's categorize what you see as, we'll call it the social justice position, or the kind of authoritarian left position on sex and where it comes from, and kind of humans being unique. I think you compared them to their stance to the Catholic Church stance, where like, yeah, evolution's fine for everyone else, but humans, so they have a soul and they're completely different. Can you just categorize, like, what are you seeing? What is the explanation that's put forth? Let's just be clear about that.
So it's it's a little difficult because they're not entirely clear. They're coming at it from all angles. So I guess if I could distill what I see them saying mostly is that um, that basically it's an argument from the existence of intersex individuals. They'll say that that the idea of two sexes is overly simplistic, and then they'll usually have some diagrams that show all the developmental pathways, all the complex arrows pointing all over the place to different certain developmental conditions that lead to one outcome, and they'll just bombard you with all this complex developmental science, and then basically this is leading them to just is meant to make you throw your hands up and conclude like what is biological sex? We really know what's going on here? And I mean, in reality, yes, we do know what's going on here. We do know what biological sex is and how this works. And basically, they're trying to portray sex as some kind of a spectrum by pointing to like this 0.02% of the population that either has ambiguous genitalia or some sort of mismatch between their genotype and sexual phenotype. But I guess the take-home message here would be that intersex conditions are not a third sex. So sex is basically the potential to produce certain types of gametes, either sperm or egg, and there's no third gamete that's being produced, basically. So the idea of two sexes, that's all there is. Intersex conditions are usually sex-specific conditions too. So basically, because they say that you can't basically put everyone 100% into one blue box and one pink box completely, then there's no distinction to be made, which is just ridiculous.
So again, as a layperson, it sounds to me like they're saying because there are anomalies, some small amount of anomalies that can't be categorized appropriately because there's I don't mean this in a moral way, but there's a defect in terms of like the replication, and there's something strange happened or unusual happened. Because there are those outliers, maybe outliers is a better word, because there are those outliers, therefore the entire categorization is invalid.
Yeah, basically. If you can point to one exception, then that disproves the rule, even if they have to search for that one exception as far as they can. And the thing is, like, with regard to like the function of sex, like there is no intermediate, so there are no there just is no individual that is perfect, like a true hermaphrodite who's producing both sperm and eggs, who could essentially fertilize themselves. Like that has never been observed in humans ever. And you said too about how people say that there's an intersex condition as a result of an error in development. And then some people will respond to that saying, how dare you call these people errors? But no one's saying that, you are an error, like as a human being as an error. It's just, it's just what we say when, things in development don't go quite as planned.
Right. And you used the analogy of hands, right? And it's like, I guess using their logic, you could say, well, if there's any six-fingered individuals out there in the world, therefore you can't say a hand has 5 digits. That's not a thing anymore.
For that analogy, it was basically that one Scientific American article that had all the charts with all the the flow charts, and is meant to confuse you about, like, do we know what sex is? Well, I mean, if you look at the chart that you could make for any developmental process, I mean, development is just inherently complex thing. There's all the timing of certain genes being turned on, interactions with hormones in certain tissues. Having a hand develop, if you were to chart that out, it would look enormously complex, and you could then trace those development of six-fingered individuals, or I don't know many deformities that happen with hands, but you could trace these out. But that would just ignore the entire fact that the vast majority of people still end up with 5 fingers, perfectly functional hands.
Right. So tell me, is this do you think this is really kind of like a fundamental attack on reason itself, or is there something like less fundamental going on? Because I got to be honest, before we started, I was browsing the web a little bit, and I found this article on everyday feminism, which is a horrible website, but the title was 3 Reasons It's Irrational to Demand Rationalism in Social Justice Activism. And the reasons were: 1, being rational has no inherent value; 2, rationalism is a tool made to hurt us. And 3, we are enough without rationalism. And I don't know. To me, there's this like, when you make the arguments that you're saying they're making, it's really a fundamental attack on the scientific method, on critical thinking, on reason itself. You can't even have a conversation if you are not willing to categorize a bimodal distribution that's 99.98% accurate as two things.
Yeah, I mean, and just that whoever wrote that article it's completely self-defeating to try to rationally make a case for why rationalism is
that's a good point.
Bad idea. I mean, what is their basis for listing things that are bad? I mean, they have to be using logic and reason, and they're rationalizing. So yeah, it makes absolutely no sense whatsoever to do anything like that. But I do see, there's definitely an attack on reason, and this is mainly from I'm not an expert in postmodernism or anything like that, but as far as what I've read and the work of like James Lindsay and everything, there does seem to be just this mentality of deconstruct everything. Like science is a tool of oppression. Knowledge is created by those that are in power, and therefore we need to just deconstruct all these narratives, and then in their place we'll just build our own realities.
Ignorance is bliss. That's the fair.
Yeah, basically.
Fair. So you said that you've seen scientists start to self-censor. You mentioned some pressure that you had. Can you talk about that a little bit? I mean, how much do scientists self-censor? I mean, is it, for those of us who aren't in academia, we all kind of assume like, that's an outlier. Mostly scientists are fine and doing their thing.
Yeah. So it's hard to quantify, that's for sure. I know that self-censoring was a really big problem for me, especially the further along I've gotten in my scientific career. I have more and more professors that are, joining my Facebook and becoming friends. And then due to this ongoing polarization, you tend to see, if you make, any moderately controversial post, people will just like pile on. And so I've just increasingly sort of self-censored, and then, through grad school, then when I'm searching for a postdoc, nobody wants to be Googled and have some, other things, have something on the internet show up that, that puts you in the camp with, Nazis or something. Right. And then, so then once I got a postdoc, then it's just like, well, now I need to be extra squeaky clean because I'm applying for faculty positions, and there's, all the hiring committees are composed of people, and you bet your butt they're going to Google your name whenever whenever they're going to hire someone for a certain position. And if you're public out there, your Twitter handle is going to be the first thing that they're showing up. Anything that you've written on there, it's going to show up. And so the competitiveness in academia is what's really keeping people from wanting to speak out. And then even if they get to the point where they get a professor position, then they have 6 years until tenure. And again, the tenure committee, if they think you're a controversial person, then that might influence your tendency to get tenure. It's hard to know how prevalent it is. I just know that at every institution I've been in, the people around me have all expressed this high level of self-censoring. Before I wrote my Quillette piece, my previous advisor and other mentors that I've had at universities, they told me, like, don't even publish this thing, not even anonymously, because it might be able to be traced back to you. Wow. And yeah, so it's a big problem for sure. And I think some studies definitely, like, there needs to be more surveys about the levels of this going on in universities. But if you look at articles come out in Quillette almost on the daily that are stressing this same type of this idea that people are not comfortable to speak out, basically.
Have you had to suffer consequences from this yet, your article, or no?
It's actually been a surprisingly positive reception. There have been some random emails I get from people who call me a bigot, and that happens on Twitter as well. I'd say the worst thing that's happened has just been somewhat recently. Some people started tweeting at Penn State trying to say, like, warning them basically that you have a bigot on your staff there who's could be compromised. Is it going to be compromising his ability to do science if he's be so biased against one group of people, where it's just ridiculous. There's nothing I've said that be construed as bigotry. And by the way, the thing that got people tweeting at Penn State was because I said that human males can't get pregnant, and that's apparently was
nice.
so transphobic that they needed to contact my employer, basically. Yeah. So that's the worst that's happened. Basically, I've had people try to get me kicked off Twitter, but I haven't had there's no protesters outside my lab or anything. Penn State is actually pretty. It seems to have avoided a lot of the big.
Well, it's kind of remote, geographically, so you don't just swing by Penn State on your way to get a burger. So
and I think the undergrad population pulls from a lot of areas in rural Pennsylvania. So you get, I don't know the demographics, but I think it's probably a little more towards the right than most undergrad classes, I think.
Right. Now, you mentioned that there's a difference between the crisis now, where there's kind of pushback against evolutionary theory, as opposed to when the pushback was coming from the right. Because when it was coming from the right and it was intelligent design, the right has basically no power in academia, but the left actually does have quite a lot of power. I looked at a few numbers quickly. A recent survey of the 40 leading universities found that in the faculty, the Democrats outnumber Republicans 11.5 to 1. So there's definitely some bias there. And if you look at the fields like social scientists, they're even more radicalized. 18% of the social scientists identify as Marxists, blatantly. Yeah. So it seems like in this case, there's a lot. The powers that be aren't helping. They're actually helping enforce this. They're not actually helping you fight against it. Is that your experience? I mean, do you have, does the dean of the university say, pull you aside and say, yeah, you're right, or does he say, shut up or you're going to get in trouble?
So I mean, it's going to vary from university to university. It's actually the main threat that a lot of people see isn't necessarily from the administrators quite as much. It's mainly from what most people worry about is the student body, basically, going on your Twitter, trying to find something that's problematic, and then basically just going nuts, and then petitioning administrators for your job, saying that you're a bigot, saying, and then when administrators have this on their hands, there's so much outrage that people just worry sometimes that it'd be almost easier just to get rid of you and save face and act like that they're putting forward a compassionate face to the world of yes, this person is gone now, the bigot who said that males can't get pregnant or something. So it's basically, the worry is that these administrations are gonna cave to the mobs of students, basically. And this is what happened to Brett Weinstein and Heather Heying, things like that. So that's I think what we're most worried about.
Okay. Now, I think to a lot of people, we viewed this. I think a lot of people know that there's been craziness happening in universities, and especially in terms of kind of radical Marxism and you mentioned deconstructionism and Derrida and the whole kind of crappy postmodern philosophy. But I think a lot of us, I have an engineering degree from years ago, and a lot of us kind of assume but that's just the crazy humanities. They're just their own thing. It's really not the sciences. But you mentioned actually that, I know anthropology isn't really a hard science, but you mentioned that a bunch of anthropology students were now kind of in this Facebook group arguing that sex was a social construct as a given. And you also talk about people learning this tenet that sex is a social construct in humanities, and then just taking it over into the sciences and applying it without question. Do you see there being more influence into the sciences from the humanities, or are they kind of keeping it at bay? I mean, how much I guess, is it getting worse? Is it getting into the sciences more, or is it?
Yeah, there's a little spillover. I don't want to like sound the alarm and act like, like they're in the labs doing like, just destroying evolution or something like that, because that's not the case. But I do know a lot of graduate students at the places, when I was in Santa Barbara and when I was a grad student at the University of Pittsburgh. There are a lot of grad students who do have these ideas. It's unclear how much this is, affecting their science. It could be negligible. You do see some push to have, like feminist biology.
What would feminist biology be? That doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah, so it's basically, it's this idea that there are a lot of questions in biology where they suffer from a male bias and perspective. So if you want to, for an example, look at, say, sexual selection, there is more focus on males making decisions, and it was a very male-centered view of what decisions are the males making, and it's kind of like the myth of the coy female, that they're just sort of this passive individual. But then this was shown not to be true at all. I mean, there's plenty of evidence that females can actually have adaptive, extra pair matings and things like that. They have all types of reasons why they could pursue multiple partners as well. And so it's a valuable perspective to have. So it's one thing to say that there is a certain maybe male bias in certain fields that need to be corrected, but the idea that we need something called feminist science to address that and to offset the male bias is not justified, because this is basically saying that we're going to just apply an equal and opposite bias to the scientific search for truth, where you don't know, because I guess what you'd want to do is say, like, well, first ask the question, is there a bias in this specific question? Don't just assume that there must be a male bias in this question. And if you can actually test to see that there is some sort of bias, then you don't address it with feminist science. You address it with
Science.
just science.
Yeah.
You get data. And if you uncover a bias that might be the result of, just more men having, their biased perspective, well, that's still just science. And then you've demonstrated using data and evidence that this bias exists. So there's no reason to modify the word science in this way that they seem to be doing. So you see more discussions like that. But again, it's hard to, I don't want to sound the alarm that the science is getting destroyed. But if you do look at certain fields like evolutionary psychology, there have been some papers out now that looked at whether or not your political affiliation, like your self-identified political scale, if you're how liberal or conservative are you, and the more liberal that you get, the more the less likely you are to want to accept innate differences in behavior. You de-stress evolutionary causes, and you tend to be more biased towards kind of a social constructivist environmental factors, and that's kind of concerning. The political affiliation, or the degree to which you identify as left or right, is going to influence the bias you're going into, the types of I guess results that you're willing to accept in a way. So that's more for the psychology, because there's sort of more of a blank slateism going on in that field. But in terms of like hardcore evolutionary biology and stuff, I don't think it's a problem, but it's definitely there. It's in the student body, and it could be a problem moving forward in the future if it's not addressed some way.
Okay.
For sure.
So it occurred to me, you talked about this idea that they're kind of requiring rejection of biology in order to show compassion and understanding towards trans individuals. And it occurs to me that if you make that a package deal, if you say compassion needs to come with rejection of biology, you're kind of setting up trans people for some pretty a lot of lack of compassion, some pretty horrid backlash, because the backlash will come wrapped without compassion, because you've linked the two as like, well, if compassion means reject biology, and I want to support biology, then it's going to come with a lack of compassion, and it seems it's almost hurting its own their own cause. It seems like the right answer is biology plus compassion. Those don't seem to be at odds to me, or they shouldn't be.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's got to be, truth has got to be the most important aspect in the whole equation here. And the thing is, I don't know, I haven't met any biologist in any of the departments I've been in that is a bigot or a transphobe. They're almost always on the left, and they're pro-LGBT rights, just across the board. Like I've not a single person who would be against gay marriage or equal rights for anyone and the right to express themselves. But also, as scientists, we know the biology, we know what sex is, we know that you can't actually change your biological sex. And so for a group to link their rights or their mission of self-fulfillment to a rejection of what we know is verifiably true, it just makes it impossible for scientists to be as good of allies as we can be, because we think that everyone should have the right to express themselves. No one should be the target of actual bigots who hate trans people because they're trans. I think I said that the main problem among a lot of trans rights activists and social justice warriors is they kind of interpret attacks to their ideology as an attack on their humanity. And that's just definitely a distinction that needs to be just made and stressed as much as possible, that we can criticize the ideas that you guys are having while still fully accepting your humanity 100%. And that's, I think that, people need to stress this more. And I do worry that a backlash that people might have to this trans militancy will be sort of an erosion of that compassion. But I think that really needs to be just stressed and held up as much as possible, because we can't lose the compassion side of that equation, because trans people, they go through hell. I mean, I don't know what it's like to have, to feel like I'm in the wrong body, and they do face a lot of oppression from people who are legitimate bigots, and that's not okay. But yeah, we can't jettison truth in favor of these narratives that, that they're actually not the sex that they were born.
Right, and ultimately it probably won't help them if we did. So.
No, and then that brings up other things about, having them participate in female sports. If we just all want to buy into the same delusion, it'll erode other things that we also value as well. So it's a balancing of values, and the route to take in all of this is just what's actually true, and we can move from that point while keeping that compassion as high as possible.
Yeah, I actually just read an article today. I forget what sporting event. It was some sprint in women's. I don't know if it was college or wherever it was, but the first and second place were trans women, which is like, it's no one really talks about how this is affecting biological women, and there's a reason that women's sports were separate from men's sports, and it's definitely having an impact. Which is why I think a lot of feminists are kind of at odds with some of this ideology as well. And you're seeing, I forget her name, but Megan something, she was recently banned on Twitter for saying men are men and women are women, right? That was... Yeah.
So there's a language game going on here. So, and this is something I'm actually writing about now, so there's a difference in the way that they refer to male and female, and then you also have them talk about men and women. And it seems like the first stage is where they wanted to separate male female from man and woman, saying that male and female was your biological sex, it's immutable, but man and woman are basically gendered terms in a form of your individual expression of your sex, basically, and these can be mismatched. And so that was, I think, an easy thing for a lot of people to swallow. Like, why do we need these two words to describe the same thing? Like, we can, gender has to do with minds and sex has to do with bodies. But then you see the switch being made now, sort of a bait and switch now. Well, once everyone was on board with sort of this, most people I think were on board with.
Yeah, I think so. I was on board with that. I was like, oh, that makes sense. I guess you could present as a woman even if you had.
But now they're going into like sporting events that are, like the women's powerlifting league, and they're saying, well, like, oh, well, the word woman is, a gendered term, even though this new word usage is very recent. And when we talk about, like, say, like the WNBA, the Women's National Basketball Association, or women's sports and women's events, like, these were clearly meant to account for, the sex differences, not gender differences.
Right.
So they're applying new usages of words to, like, old laws and reinterpreting the words in old laws through the lens of, like, this new linguistic switch that they've done. And so now they're saying, like, well, why can't we be, competing in women's powerlifting because we're women? Everyone was on board with us being women, right? Like, it's a gendered thing, but they were never created to, to account for the ways people subjectively feel about themselves. They were created to account for real athletic differences between males and females. Maybe we need to change it to, like, the FNVA or the, female powerlifting.
Right. The XX and XY groups or whatever.
Yeah. There's so much equivocation going between man, woman, male, and female, and it seems that they either mean different things or the same thing depending on what furthers their agenda the quickest. And it's something definitely to be weary of and to point out whenever you can.
It seems like the ultimate victim in all these cases is cisgendered women, and I almost feel like this would be like a weird, twisted plot of like a patriarchal evil conspiracy in some weird movie where it's like, I know what we'll do. We'll convince them that we can present as women, and then we'll just take over, like biological males will take over everything, and we'll get the radical left to agree with us. It's almost brilliant if that were the plan, which I don't think it is, but
yeah, it's ridiculous. And yeah, there's a lot of women that they're super concerned, and so they should be, about their sports being infiltrated by biological males. And yeah, I think it's getting a lot more attention just in the last several weeks or month or so. It seems to be more front and center. So yeah, that'll be interesting to see how this whole thing develops. It might take the Olympics and a lot of people winning, a lot of trans athletes winning gold and seeing more females, lower on the podium to really make it, shockingly obvious that maybe there's a problem going on here. But we'll see.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned that, you're not sounding the alarm for science yet. Do you think just...
I would say I think you need to ring... I'm sounding the alarm a little bit. It's definitely like it's a warning.
We're DEFCON 4. Is that what you were?
Yeah. It's not a 5-alarm fire, but it's definitely like there's some smoke, and maybe we should check that out because it could be spreading very quickly very soon.
Okay.
We're not sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
And do you think this is a vocal minority that is pushing this, or is this on college campuses? A lot of us just aren't on college campuses at all. Is this kind of the majority view of the students there, or is this just a very vocal minority?
It's a vocal minority. So there was some sort of study that came out that really focused on, I think they identified, I want to say like 7% of the people on like the left end of the spectrum. They're the ones that are like the engaged left, who are the ones that are the more vocal radicals. And I think that's probably about right. But then there's also a difference between those who are like really pushing that agenda and then a larger group that is acquiescing to that agenda, that's not really standing in the way of those loud people. And that's what I think we need those people to be more engaged and to really, say like, whoa, this is, hold up a little bit here. But a lot of those people, they're just not interested in a lot of this. I find a lot of my colleagues, they just want to do science in their labs. They don't care about the broad culture wars. And so when people are like, trying to push these agendas and they want to have, feminist science meetup or do, they usually just don't care because they don't think it's a problem, because they're just being good scientists working in their lab, and you can't really fault them, in a big way, but at the same time, it's their nonchalance that's kind of letting this spread faster than it should be, because they're not pushing back like a lot of people who are really kind of paying attention, I think, are trying to do.
Right. I think that makes sense. Now, do you think anything can be done really? Like, what would you suggest to try and reverse this or fight this? Does it require scientists paying more attention to culture, or can the rest of us kind of help in some way?
Yes, I mean, ultimately, I think it needs to come from more and more people just being willing to speak up and put themselves out in the open for this. Being willing, not. There's you could just put you could have an anonymous Twitter account, but I thought about doing that when I wrote my article, but I decided at the end of the day that it would just be much more powerful to actually have a name on there where people can see, like, this is a real person who's coming forward. You do see a lot of anonymous Twitter accounts, and it's understandable why, but I think what it's going to take is a lot of more people to just sort of resist it and say, like, actually, this is a problem. Biological sex is real. I'm not going to acquiesce to your demands just because you guys are loud. And I think we're actually seeing a lot more of that happening nowadays. More people are willing to speak up, and I think at some point there's just going to be some quorum that's going to be reached, and then all of a sudden, hopefully, it'll switch where the people are going to be more embarrassed to bring up the insane views like sex is a social construct. Because ideally, those would be the views that would have the social cost for voicing them, not people.
Yes.
Not biologists who are saying, like, actually sex is real, like, but people are self-censoring, even biologists saying something as obvious as that. And the fact that we're in a world where a biologist might get in trouble for saying, biological sex is a real thing, it's just madness. That if we're going to self-censor on this topic that is basically like the lowest hanging fruit of something that's so easily observably true, then what aren't we going to push back on? So more people need to speak up, I think.
So that's an optimistic, I think, viewpoint. Let me just play.
I'm optimistic.
Let me play the pessimist for a minute, though, because Twitter doesn't let you do that. Twitter is shutting down people who say men are men and women are women, and so Twitter is on their side. It's not an open forum. And you mentioned Twitter as being kind of the de facto platform for social discourse or political discourse. What do we do about that? What do we do about the fact that Twitter is clearly run by social justice warriors?
Yeah, so I think for at least the short term, we need to be able to just be extremely precise in the language we use on Twitter, because Twitter has completely doubled down on the gender self-ID definition of gender, where it's you're the gender that you say you are, and if you misgender someone, if you use the word he to describe for someone who identifies as a she, that's misgendering. You can get banned for life for doing that. But so I've refused to play that game. Whenever I'm on Twitter, I just make absolutely sure that if I'm talking about biological sex, I'm using male and female. And if I'm talking about gender, I want to have them, you tell me what gender is, so I know what you're talking about here, because I don't want to be baited. And you will see them try to bait you into, like, you'll make an argument saying something like when I said, human males can't get pregnant, someone will respond, yes, men can get pregnant. And it's like, well, you said men, I said males. And then they'll try to get you to then play their language game, so then you disagree with them and say something like men aren't women or women aren't men, which are gendered terms, and then you're going to get flagged and potentially banned.
Interesting. So, okay.
Yeah, that's what they're doing. And so even though there's a perfectly reasonable argument to be made that there's many different definitions of gender. If you're a radical feminist, it's more of a social construct in the way that society genders individuals. and it has to do with like the norms and expectations and roles associated with perceived biological sex. Like that's one framework that they're working with. Then you have like the gender self-ID people, which is just like, I am the gender that I say I am, and that may or may not be equivalent to sex depending on the weather. And then there's people that are conservatives who, whenever they say the word gender, they're essentially just meaning biological sex. Like if you look on your,
right,
some driver's license might say gender. Like, well, no one asked me, how I identified. It's clearly just what they mean when they refer to sex. And so you have all these different uses of gender. We all need to realize that Twitter has decreed that the gender self-ID ideology is their basis for banning individuals. And so I don't use that at all. I as a biologist, I'm just going to talk about sex when I mean sex, male, female, and I try to not even use gendered terms as much as I possibly can. And I find that people have tried to report me for, saying things, but I think because of my precise use of male, female, that is, so far it's been a good shield against that.
Yeah, fingers crossed. I think a lot of people don't realize that. I didn't until you just said it. I hadn't thought of it in those terms of like, oh, male and female are biological sex terms and men and women are gendered terms. Like, I hadn't thought of that.
That's probably the biggest source of confusion that you see on Twitter right now, when people talk about gender and just everyone's using man, woman in completely different ways. And so I'm writing an article about this right now just because it's just causing so much confusion. It's kind of, I would compare it to if you're talking to someone and you ask them if they believe in God, and they might say, oh, yes, I do. And you might say, oh, me too. But then, you mean, like, you're a pantheist and you mean the universe when you're talking about the God. And then this other person who agreed with you that God exists means, they're mean like a Orthodox Christian God who answers your prayers. Like, they actually don't agree on anything. They just agree that they believe in the noise God, even though there's no actual like conceptual agreement going on whatsoever. And that's what's happening on Twitter. And that's what's getting people banned for inadvertently saying, like Megan Murphy, when she got banned for saying...
That's who it was. Thank you, Megan Murphy.
Yeah, she got banned for saying, men aren't women, though. And in the radical feminist framework, they use men and women in different ways than the gender self-ID people, the trans rights activists. And then she got banned, that was her first suspension. Then she got banned when she referred to someone like, yes, that's him, because him, her, those are gendered terms. And so it's the misgendering that Twitter is getting people banned for. So,
but if she had said males aren't females, she would have been safe.
I would be shocked if they banned her for that.
Interesting.
Yeah, but they might. Who knows? They might start doing that too, because they've apparently are okay with changing meanings of words recently, and they could change them again. And people might. And there are a bunch of trans people who are saying that you need to call us. We are biologically male now, and so depending on how much Twitter wants to protect people who identify as a different sex rather than gender, it could end up being taboo to say males aren't females. Although that's one thing I'll never stop saying as a biologist. It's just true. So
sure.
Yeah.
I sometimes wonder even if the most trans people are even on board with some of this crazy activism. I'm not so sure. I imagine that a lot of trans people are just kind of look at this radical social justice stuff and kind of wish that they would just shut up and stop making a big deal and let them go live their lives.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. Within any group, it's going to be the most vocal minority. I did an appearance on TV maybe a month ago with Jen Smith, and she was a trans woman. Actually, it goes by he pronouns though, and him, because they identify themselves as a male. They don't buy the whole, they're realists. She completely admits that they're biologically male, but they identify as a woman, and they have expressed themselves in that way. But she just got banned on Twitter, actually permanently recently as well.
For what?
For misgendering, because she uses
for misgendering herself or someone else. Yeah.
Somebody else, because they didn't buy into the gender ID framework. They're more of the social construction, like gender roles type framework of he and she, man and woman.
Interesting.
So, yeah.
So, I just want to wrap it up. We're getting close to the end here. I guess the last question I have for you is, do you have any advice for aspiring biologists who, maybe they're undergrad, they just got out of high school, they're going to get their degree in biology, they want to be an evolutionary biologist. What advice do you have for them?
So if you're looking for grad schools, I would say choose your school not based on the school. Choose it by the PI, the professor who's doing the work. Choose to work in a lab that's doing work you find super interesting, because you got to do it for 5 or more years, and you're going to get burned out if you're doing something you hate. Start publishing papers as soon as you can, because that's the currency in science. And if you're going to be trying to look for postdocs or jobs, that's the first thing they're going to look for is how many first authored papers you have. And do your best to, I guess, speak up along the way, and try not to self-censor too much if at all possible. All I got.
Awesome. Well, thank you. I really appreciate your time, Colin. Can we just tell people how do you want them to follow you? Twitter is the best way. What's the best way for people to pay attention to what you're doing?
Yeah, I guess Twitter is probably the way to follow me. It's at Swipe Right, so WRIGHT. It's my last name. So yeah, that's probably the best way. I'm on there pretty frequently, sharing stuff. So yeah,
awesome.
Send me a message, or my email is also on there too if you guys want to email me.
Great. Well, thank you for joining. Thank you everyone for watching this episode. You can follow us at Unsafe Space Co. on Twitter. You can go to youtube.com/unsafespace, and unsafespace.co is our URL. So thanks everyone for watching, and we'll see you next time.